go ahead and say thank you to the congregation, to the elders for allowing me to come. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but the reason I chose to talk about Christ as our Passover lamb is because yesterday was Passover, in case you weren't aware. So, in Genesis chapter 1, after each of the days, after each of the 6 days at least, it says the evening and the morning were the first day, the second day, and so forth. And the reason that's significant, or at least the reason to pay note of that, is at least the Jews thought it was significant, and that's how they ordered the day. They ordered the day from evening until morning. So yesterday would be the 14th of the month, the Hebrew month Nisan, or Aviv, and so at sundown would be the beginning of the next day, so that would be the beginning of today. But that's what I would like to look at. The institution of the Passover is mostly recorded in Exodus chapter 12, and that's where we're going to spend most of our time. So go ahead and turn to Exodus chapter 12. And the first thing I'd like to do is just look at the details of the Passover. How is the Passover intended to be conducted? Now, Exodus chapter 12 is the initial celebration. The initial celebration of the Passover is going to be distinct in certain ways, certain important ways, from the feast that was to continue as a memorial. Let's just start at the beginning of Exodus chapter 12. The Lord spoke unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. So whatever calendar they were using previously, this was not the beginning of the months. God appoints this as the beginning of the month. This is where your calendar is going to start. In Genesis chapter 1, and Genesis chapters 1 and 2, God appoints the week, and he bases that off of what he has done. Right here, God is appointing the year, the months of the year, based on what he has done. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak ye unto all the congregation of Israel, saying, In the 10th day this month they shall take to them every man a lamb according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for an ounce. If the household be too little for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to him, next to his house, take it according to the number of the souls. Every man according to his eating shall make your count for the lamb. The lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. Ye shall take it out from the sheep or from the goats, and ye shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. So from the 10th day of the month to the 14th day of the month. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. And they shall take of the blood and strike it on the 2 side posts and on the upper doorpost of the houses, wherein they shall eat it. And they shall eat the flesh in that night, but roast with fire, his head with his legs and with the purtenance thereof, and he shall let nothing of it remain until the morning. Not which remaineth of it until the morning you shall burn with fire. And thus shall you eat it with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night. And I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where ye are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. And this day shall be unto you for a memorial. And you shall keep it a feast of unleavened bread. For in this selfsame day I have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day in your generations, mine ordinance forever. And we're not going to keep reading because I think that's enough for the moment. So the basic structure that God is presenting to them. On the 10th day of the month, they're to select a lamb from their flocks. Some people raise sheep, some people raise goats. Maybe they raise both till Saturday. The evening of Tuesday until Saturday. And you just have this lamb. Now, why they had to keep it for the 4 days, there's not really much explanation on that. My personal supposition is that that's so that they get acquainted with it, and it reminds them that that's a living being. If you look in the book of Leviticus, whenever they were to bring a burnt offering before the Lord, what were they to do? Before the priest would kill it, they were to place their hand on the head of the beast. Why is that? That's to remind them that that's a living being. They're to feel the death of that creature. And by having this animal in their homes for 4 days, I mean, it's not the same level of intimacy that you would have with a pet. But it's probably something just enough to remind them. The lamb or the kid is to be without blemish of the first year. So it's a young creature. It's not fully matured. It's young. It's perfect. Right? You're bringing the best. Now, some of these rules are the same for the burnt offering, the other types of sacrifices that they would have to do, which, of course, they learn more about in the book of Leviticus. That's not covered in Exodus, largely. They are to slaughter the animal. They take the blood. They put it on the doorposts. And then the sign of the blood is so that God will know to pass over their house and not strike them with the plague. And then they roast the lamb, the whole thing, not break any of the bones. That's not mentioned in that passage. It's mentioned in a later verse. They're not to break any of the bones. Then they eat it, destroy the rest with fire, and then they leave. They prepare their dough of the unleavened kind because they don't have time. If you've ever baked, I don't like to bake. I'm a terrible baker. I like to cook, but I don't like to bake. Why? Because baking requires a lot of precision. You have to be very careful. The temperature has to be right, and you have to let the dough rise, and it has to rise for hours. And they don't have hours. And 6. Speak ye to this, regardless of whether or not they're thinking in terms of pointing forward. It represents bringing the best that they have for God. That's when you think about the way these feasts were carried out. I don't know of any time. You can read the Old Testament. I don't know of any point in time when the people as a whole faithfully kept the feasts. It's not specifically mentioned in such and such a way. And I think, to a certain extent, it was that way on purpose. Not because God wants to make things just too hard for us to do. But when you read First Chronicles, the first 10 chapters is what? What's the first 10 chapters of Chronicles? Well, not just Kings. Specifically the book of First Chronicles. You just read and it's just names, children, and so begat so-and-so. And they had to keep these records. And it's tedious to read. It is. And it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be tedious to read. You're supposed to read that and say, wow, this is a lot of work. That's a lot to keep up with. Now, why'd they have to keep up with that? Okay? Immediately. What was the immediate reason? Eventually. They were Jewish. There's something very specific I'm looking for. Okay, that's true. Okay, for the purpose of the inheritances, There was one tribe in particular that was really important to trace. The Levites. Why? You couldn't be a priest unless, not just, it wasn't just being a Levite. You couldn't just be a Levite. That wasn't enough. I mean, that's the objection that Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, they said, we're Levites. Why can't we do whatever we want to do? You'd be a descendant of Aaron. So there were privileges that belonged to the Levites. There were privileges that belonged to the descendants of one of his sons, Kohath, his descendants, Aaron. And those were the priests. The descendants of Aaron were the priests. It's a lot of work. And I think that's to remind us. I think as we read that and we think, this is tedious to read. And when you read through, and sometimes you'll be reading through, and if you read through 1 Chronicles, and you read through the descendants of the Levites, and you read through the children of Aaron, you come across Samuel, you're like, oh, that makes so much sense. And then you're excited, but then you keep going back to reading names that you've never heard of. And it's to remind you that we don't have to do that anymore. Taking care of sin is not an easy task. Taking care of sin requires a lot of hard work. And when we read about the sacrifices, it's the same way. Was it hard? Yes, it was very hard. And that was supposed to trigger maybe a few thoughts in their minds. And perhaps one of those thoughts was, this is really hard. It's really hard to atone for sin. Maybe I should stop sinning so I'd have less to atone for. We'll get back to that. But there's the perfection of the Lamb, and that's really important. By the time you get to the days of Malachi, the people they're just bringing whatever they want. The maimed, the broken. God says, you wouldn't give this to your governor, but you bring this to me. 1 or 2 households, depending on satisfy everyone. But it's personal. It's not that there's going to be a lamb slaughtered in the midst of the camp that is for everyone. Why does everyone need to have a lamb? Everyone sins. And in the immediate context, everyone needs to be saved from this calamity. God is going to bring judgment, and every individual, every family, has a firstborn. If you look at it, it says that in the Egyptian households, in verse 30, it says, Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his in Egypt, where there was not a house where there was not one dead. Can you imagine that? I mean, we've been through this past year, and we've seen, a glimpse at what, a disease or a plague of sorts can do. And I think all of us know someone or know of someone who's passed away from the disease. But can you imagine if every single household someone died? Can you imagine? I can't imagine that. You talk about decimation. The firstborn in every household. Every single one, every single family of the Hebrews needed to be saved. They needed redemption from the plague. And so they had to kill the animal and to apply the blood. Which brings us to the power. So if you're keeping track of the P words, perfectionals, power. The power of the blood. We sing the song, There's Power in the Blood. Verses 12 and 13. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where ye are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. Now, this doesn't occur. But let's imagine for a moment that there was a family who said, well, I'm a son of Abraham. There's some folks who say that later on in John chapter 8, John chapter 5, John chapter 8. I'm a son of Abraham. I'll be fine. I'm not one of those Egyptians. And they said, I don't really care for lamb meat. It's kind of nasty, and goat's even worse. So I'm just not going to do that. What do you suppose would happen? They'd be affected. Maybe they're the firstborn. Maybe they have a firstborn. Perhaps they both die. I don't know. Maybe his entire family. I mean, that could happen, right? It wasn't their birthright that saved them. They were saved through the power of the blood. And that's important because throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament, God takes extensive measures to remind us that salvation does not come by our own merits. Salvation doesn't come because we earned it. When you look at Gideon, why does the famous story where the number of the people reduces from, 30,000? 35,000 and to 300. Why? Why did it reduce so much? Because God said, I don't want you. God said, I know what you're going to do because you're people. And this is what y'all do. God says, you're going to do this anyway, but I want to take away the excuse. You're not defeating the enemy because you're just so amazing. You're defeating the enemy because I'm delivering them into your hand. When they applied the blood, it wasn't their own merits. It wasn't because they were just such a fantastic people. They weren't. It was because God said, I will save those who put the blood on their doorposts and on the lintel. And so they did that. And that's the power of the blood. And it leads to the preservation of the congregation, the preservation of the people. If you look down to verse 28, it says, the children of Israel went away and did as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. So did they. If only they kept that up. But in verse 30, as we read a moment ago, Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants, all the Egyptians. There was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. The Egyptians are heavily affected. But in verse 41 it says, it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, in the selfsame day it came to pass that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. And I take this to mean, at least, since there's no insinuation otherwise, that all of the children, as it said, all of the children of Israel did what they were told to do. All of the Hebrews followed God's commands. They put the blood on the posts, and they were subsequently saved. And you may be thinking, well, this sounds a lot like the previous point. And it's similar, but there's a distinct difference. You see, God tells them about the power of the blood, but it requires their own faith to apply it. And their faith is confirmed to be well-founded because God keeps his promise. God says, I won't destroy you, but I will destroy the Egyptians. And what happens? He destroys the Egyptians and he doesn't destroy the Hebrews. There's a lot of lessons here. There's a lot of lessons here that carry over directly into our lives. There's a lot of lessons that carry over directly into our understanding of what grace is and what faith is and what salvation is. Their trust in God wasn't confined to simply, oh, well, God usually means what he says, that's nice, and then just carrying on about their day. Their faith involved them doing something. Their faith involved them applying the blood to their houses. And their faith, as they continue, it involved them, making the dough.